In this video series, we're going to start taking a look at one of the most fundamental sorts of aspects of this entire course, and that's taking a look at functions. And we're going to study a lot of functions throughout this course. We're going to start with some really basic functions. And one of the most important things that we can look at is the graphs of the functions. First of all, we're going to determine if a relation is a function. We're going to define what a relation is. We're going to evaluate functions at specific points within their domain. So we're going to talk about what a domain is as well. We're going to make sure that we can substitute algebraic expressions into functions and then simplify the resulting expression. We're going to determine if the graph of a relation represents a function or not a function. And then we're going to evaluate functions at specific points on the graph of the function. And then finally, we're going to find the domain, range, and intercepts of the function given the graph. So what is a function? Well, an equation, so we looked at some of these earlier in the previous videos. So we might have something like y equals x minus 2. We probably saw something like that, or y equals 6 minus x squared. And those are called relations, all right? So anytime we have a relationship where x governs what y is, then that's a relationship between two variables. And so what we're looking for is we're looking for this sort of relationship that for every specific one input, that there's going to be one output. And so that's what a function is. A function is a relationship in which each element in some set of numbers A is assigned to exactly one value in set B. In other words, x cannot have the single value of x can't have two distinct values. And I'll show you in a moment what that means. All the possible inputs, in other words, all the values in set A are called the domain. So anything you can put into the function is going to be the domain, and anything we can get out of it, which in other words is the set of possible values in the other set, is going to be called the range. And so the way I think about the domain is the input, while the range is going to be the output. One of the most or I think one of the best ways to try to conceptualize what a function is thinking of it like a machine. So let's say, for instance, this is like a soda machine or something like that. And you know that if you put in some money, all right, so let's say we put some money into our machine, all right, and what we should get out is we should get out a soda. All right, so I'm going to do my best to draw a soda here. Um, and every time we put in the right amount of money, which is going to be the domain, then we're going to get a soda out. But we know that sometimes people try to put things into soda machines that they shouldn't. Okay, so they might try to jam like a stick in there or something like that, and that's not part of the domain. Now, we very rarely get two cans of soda out for one input. Okay, so if we got two cans of soda, that wouldn't necessarily be a function because it's not necessarily what we need from the machine. All right, so another way to think of a function is to kind of just draw these circles like we have here and think, okay, well, if I take a class, okay, or if I was in high school or a college class, we know that every time we get a number grade, it only assigns itself to one letter grade. All right, so we could certainly have somebody get a 94 or 95 in a class, and those students would almost always get an A in the course. All right, we know 51 assigns to an F, but we know that a 51 doesn't assign itself to a D and an F. All right, so that would make it not a function. All right, we're going to see that in a few moments as we go through some examples of this. But a function basically says for every one input, there's going to be one specific output. It doesn't mean that every single element in the range is going to be identified by the domain. All right, so notice that over here with our number grades, nobody got a 60 in the class, and usually a 60 represents a D or a 63 or a 65 or something of that nature. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples as to where if we have a relation, we determine if it's a function, and if it's not a function, we explain why. So the first one we have is this relation. So this whole thing is a relation. And we have the points 3, 4, 2, -1, 5, 4, and 8, 18. And so what we can do is we can draw a box, and this is going to be our domain. And within our domain, we have the values 3, 2, 5, and 8. Okay, and again, I just looked at the x coordinates, and that told us what our domain is. Now, we're going to take a look at the range. And the range is going to be the y values. Right? So we have a 4, we have a -1. We already have 4, we're not going to note it twice, and we have an 18. And what we're going to do is we're going to map the domain to the range. So we know that 3 is going to map to 4. And we know that 2 is going to map to -1. And we know that 5 is going to also map to 4. And then finally, we know 8 is going to map to 18. And it's okay to have or a single value in the range have two values in the domain point to it, or two values that are assigned to it. So this one, yes, it is a function, right? But let's take a look at a secondary example. So we have this 7, comma 1, 6, 4, 7, 3, and 8, 16. And so once again, we can just draw our domain and our range. Right? So this is our domain, and this is our range. And we're just going to fill in the values. So we have a 7, we have a 6, and we have an 8. All right, and we don't duplicate values. For the range, we have a 1, we have a 4, we have a 3, and we have a 16. And we said that a 7 is going to point to a 1. We said a 6 is going to point to a 4. But then we also say 7 is going to point to 3, and then 8 is going to point or a map to 16. And I want you to notice right here that this value 7 has two outputs. If you ever have an input that has two outputs, that is not a function. So we're going to say that this is not a function. And we're going to say since 7 has two distinct outputs. Right? So again, if you think of a function like a machine or a relation like a machine, this is how we're going to try to identify those. All right, so that's how we go through and identify all the different components of what a function is. So again, a function is like a machine. All the sets of inputs is a domain. All the sets of outputs is going to be a range. And there's only certain things you can put into the machine. There's only certain things you can get out of it. Now, we're going to take a look at these algebraically in the next video to determine if we have an equation, if it's going to be a relation or not, or if the relation is going to be a function or it's not.